November 12, 1886, Divide County, Dakota Territory. The wind was already biting, carrying that metallic taste of snow that hits the back of your throat before the clouds even turn gray. But the sound echoing across the ridge wasn't the wind. It was laughter. Specifically, it was the laughter of Silas Vane. Silas was a man who prided himself on doing things the right way. The old way? He had built his cabin 3 months prior, using 18-inch diameter Ponderosa pine, notched at the corners, chinked with moss and mud. It was a fortress of tradition, a standard dovetail build that generations of frontiersmen swore by. 200 yards down the creek, Elias Thorne was building something that looked, to the untrained eye, like a coffin for a giant. Elias wasn't stacking logs, he was standing them up. And he wasn't using massive timbers, he was using split planks. What looked like scrap wood to the men of the Divide? He had set a sill plate on a stone foundation and was erecting 2 thin, parallel walls of vertical timber, spaced exactly 10 inches apart. Silas Vane walked his horse over to the property line, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the frozen grass. He watched Elias hammer a thin plank into place. The wall wobbled slightly in the gust. Thorne, Silas shouted over the wind, a smirk cutting through his beard. You building a birdcage or a house? A stiff breeze is gonna fold that lumber like a playing card. Elias didn't look up. He just reached into a bucket of iron nails, putting 2 in his mouth before driving a 3rd into the stud. It'll hold. Silas, it's hollow. Elias, Silas laughed, gesturing to the 10-inch gap between the inner and outer wooden skins. You got empty air between those walls. You think air is gonna stop a Dakota blizzard? When the mercury hits 40 below, you're gonna freeze to death inside that hollow box? That is, if the wind doesn't knock it down first. Elias finally stopped. He set his hammer down on the frozen earth and looked Silas in the eye. It won't be hollow by sundown. What happened next became local legend. Elias didn't pack the walls with sawdust, which would settle and rot. He didn't fill them with moss. He brought a wagon round the back, loaded with a thick, gray slurry he had been mixing by the creek for 3 days. It was a dense, heavy mixture of wet river clay, crushed limestone, and long-stem prairie straw. As the neighbors watched in confused silence, Elias began shoveling the heavy mud into the void between his 2 flimsy wooden walls. He took a heavy wooden tamper and pounded it down. Thump, 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 ramming the earth until it was dense as rock. Silas shook his head, turning his horse back toward his own heavy log cabin. Now he's just built a mud tomb, he muttered. Damp walls. He'll die of pneumonia before the freeze gets him. Silas Vane was right about one thing. A storm was coming, but he was wrong about the physics. He didn't understand that Elias Thorne wasn't building a house. He was building a machine. And when the Great White Death descended on the plains 2 months later, that machine would be the only thing standing between life and frozen oblivion. To understand why Elias Thorne survived when better men perished, you have to understand where he came from. Elias wasn't a farmer, and he wasn't a trapper. Before he came west to claim his 160 acres, he had spent a decade in the industrial brickyards of Philadelphia, and before that, he had studied the old stone farmhouses of the Pennsylvania Dutch. He understood a concept that the frontier log stackers ignored: thermal mass. The traditional log cabin, like the one Silas built, relies on the insulating properties of wood. Wood is a decent insulator. It has an R value of roughly 1.4 per inch. A thick log wall will slow down the transfer of heat, but wood is light. It cannot store heat. Once the fire goes out, a log wall cools down almost instantly. Elias knew the Dakota Territory didn't just get cold. It got violently cold. He knew that to survive -30 degrees with wind chill, you didn't just need to stop the heat from leaving. You needed a battery to store the heat when you had it. That's what the hollow wall actually was. The 2 skins of wood were just the formwork, the mold. The 10 inches of rammed clay and limestone inside was the engine. By compressing the clay mixture, Elias was creating a monolithic thermal mass, effectively a stone wall protected by a wood skin. While the neighbors were mocking the flimsy look of the vertical planks, they failed to calculate the density. A cubic foot of dry pine weighs about 25 to 30 pounds. A cubic foot of rammed earth weighs 120 pounds. Elias wasn't building a flimsy box. He was building a bunker that weighed 4 times as much as a log cabin. anchored to the earth by gravity itself. But wisdom is rarely appreciated until disaster strikes. If you appreciate the engineering of survival, make sure you're subscribed. We dig up the forgotten blueprints of history every single week. The test of Elias's mud tomb arrived on January 9, 1887. History books call it the winter of the big die-up. It wasn't a normal winter. A high-pressure system from the Arctic collided with moisture from the Gulf, creating a meteorological bomb. The temperature in the Dakota Territory didn't just drop, it crashed. At noon, it was a tolerable 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By 4 p.m., the temperature had plummeted to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts clocked at 60 miles per hour. The sensory violence of that night is hard to describe. Survivors wrote that the air grew so cold, so fast, that the sap inside the trees froze and expanded with a sound like rifle shots. Crack, crack. The forests were exploding. Over at Silas Vane's cabin, the situation was deteriorating into a nightmare. Silas had a roaring fire in his hearth. He was burning oak and pine as fast as he could split it. But a traditional log cabin has a fatal flaw in high wind. The stack effect combined with infiltration, the wind outside was screaming at 60 miles per hour. It found every microscopic gap in Silas's chinking. The moss and mud he had packed between his logs froze, contracted, and cracked. The wind drove needle-like drafts through the walls. Worse, the massive fire Silas built required oxygen. To feed the flames, the fireplace sucked air from the room. Because the cabin wasn't airtight, this vacuum pulled freezing cold air in through the cracks in the walls at high velocity. Silas was roasting his front and freezing his back. The temperature in the corners of his room dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The water in the bucket near the door had frozen solid. His wife and 2 children were huddled under 3 layers of buffalo robes, shivering violently. The heat was escaping through the walls faster than the fire could generate it. The wind was the final insult. A standard log cabin relies on gravity and corner notches for stability. But 60 miles per hour winds exert tremendous lateral pressure. The walls of Silas's cabin began to creak and groan. The roof, catching the wind like a sail, threatened to lift. Silas spent that night terrified, bracing a heavy timber against the door, listening to the wind howl like a banshee, praying the wood would hold. 200 yards away, inside the hollow house, the scene was bizarrely different. Elias Thorne was sitting in a rocking chair, reading a copy of Harper's Weekly by the light of a kerosene lamp. He was wearing a wool shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. The wind outside was hitting his house with the same 60 miles per hour fury, but the house didn't creak, it didn't groan. The 10-inch core of rammed earth, weighing nearly 50 tons around the perimeter, made the structure immovable. The wind simply broke against it like a wave hitting a cliff. But the real miracle was the temperature. Elias had let his fire die down to coals 3 hours ago. By all logic, the cabin should be freezing, but the thermometer on the wall read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Why? Because for the last 12 hours, the roaring fire had been dumping heat into the dense clay walls. The clay, unlike wood, had absorbed those BTUs like a sponge sucking up water. Now, as the fire faded and the outside temperature hit 40 below, the walls were reversing the flow. The clay was radiating heat back into the room. If you touched the interior wooden planks, they felt warm to the hand. Elias was living inside a thermal battery. The storm raged for 3 days. It was a white hurricane. Visibility was 0. To step outside without a rope tied to your waist was suicide. You would get turned around in the whiteout and freeze 5 feet from your door. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was deafening. The sun rose over a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, white still and dead. Silas Vane, frostbitten and exhausted, finally managed to pry his frozen door open. He had run out of firewood. His family was alive, but barely. They were in the early stages of hypothermia. The inside of his cabin was 15 degrees Fahrenheit. He saw smoke rising from Elias's chimney. Desperation broke his pride. Silas wrapped his feet in burlap sacks, his boots were frozen stiff, and trudged through waist-deep snow toward the hollow house. He expected to find Elias dead. He expected to find the flimsy walls collapsed. Instead, he found the house sitting stark and solid against the snow. He hammered on the door with a frozen fist. Elias opened it. The sensation that hit Silas wasn't just warmth. It was a physical wall of heat. It smelled of coffee and bacon. It was the smell of life. Silas stumbled inside, falling to his knees on the floorboards. He gasped, the warm air rushing into his burning lungs. He looked up at Elias, then at the walls. He pulled off his glove and pressed his hand against the vertical planks. They were warm. How? Silas croaked, his voice raspy from the cold. I burned 3 cords of wood. I nearly burned the house down trying to stay warm. You barely have smoke coming out. Elias poured a cup of coffee and handed it to the shivering man. I didn't heat the air, Silas. I heated the dirt. Let's break down the physics of why the neighbors nearly died while Elias was comfortable, because the math is brutal and unforgiving. This comes down to the battle between Arval and thermal mass, and the concept of thermal lag. The neighbors' log cabins had a higher theoretical R-value insulation than Elias's clay walls. Wood is a better insulator than compressed earth. However, insulation only slows heat transfer. It doesn't store it. In a survival situation with a heat source, a fire that fluctuates roaring during the day, dying at night, insulation isn't enough. Elias utilized thermal lag. Density. The rammed earth density was approx 120 pounds per foot cubed. Specific heat capacity. Dry earth has a specific heat capacity of about 0.2 BTU lbf. The calculation, if Elias had 10 tons 20,000 pounds of earth in his walls heated just 10 degrees above ambient room temp, his walls were holding 20,000 BTUs of energy. When the fire died, that energy had to go somewhere. Heat always moves from hot to cold. As the air in the room cooled, the walls dumped that stored energy back into the living space. Furthermore, the air infiltration rate of Elias's house was near zero. The double shell method created a continuous envelope. The wet clay mixture was poured against the wooden skins, creating a perfect air seal as it dried. There were no chinking gaps, no cracks for the wind to penetrate. Silas's log cabin was a sieve. It changed the air inside the room every 20 minutes, 3 air changes per hour. Elias's cabin changed the air maybe once every 3 hours. Silas was trying to heat the whole Dakota Territory. Elias was only heating his kitchen. There was also the factor of ballistic protection. While not relevant to the cold, the storm proved the structural superiority. The pressure of the clay pushing out against the timber skins created a pre-stressed tension. The walls were rigid. When the 60 miles per hour winds hit Silas's cabin, the logs shifted and chinking fell out. When the wind hit Elias's cabin, the mass absorbed the kinetic energy without vibrating. The spring thaw of 1887 was a grim season. The Big Dop had killed up to 90% of the cattle on the open range. Carcasses littered the coulees. Many homesteaders simply packed up and left, broken by the cold. But Silas Vane didn't leave, and he didn't laugh at Elias Thorne anymore. That summer, if you rode through the divide, you would see a strange sight. The neighbors who remained were stripping the siding off their barns and houses. They were erecting secondary walls. They were digging up the riverbanks. They were retrofitting their homes with Thorne's mud. Elias's weird build wasn't actually new. He had essentially adapted the ancient technique of piece de terre rammed earth and hybridized it with the timber framing of the American West. Today, we see descendants of this technology in ICF, insulated concrete forms, and high-mass passive solar homes. Modern architects charge thousands of dollars to design thermal flywheels into eco-mansions. Elias built his with scrap wood and mud. The frontier was a brutal filter. It didn't care about tradition, aesthetics, or what your grandfather did back in Ohio. It asked one question: does it work? Silas Vane looked at a hollow wall and saw a joke. Elias Thorne looked at it and saw a battery. One man froze, the other thrived. In the end, the secret wasn't the wood, and it wasn't the clay. The secret was the willingness to look at the raw materials of the wild and see the physics hidden inside them. If you're planning a build, or just want to survive the next storm, remember, insulation slows the cold, but mass holds the heat. Sometimes the craziest idea is the only one that keeps you alive. Stay warm out there.